Welcome to the Explainer. When you're just scrolling through the news, it's really easy to see headlines about conflicts in entirely different corners of the globe and just assume, well, they're completely isolated events, right? But today, we're going to unpack how these seemingly distant regional crises are actually locked into a deeply interconnected global strategic triangle. We're going to look at this fascinating chain reaction where a maritime conflict triggers a diplomatic fallout, which then, in turn, directly impacts the defense of a sovereign nation literally thousands of miles away.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll cover the crisis in the Middle East. Then look at the internal tensions within the NATO alliance. See how that impacts the conflict in Ukraine. And finally, wrap up with a broader world security analysis.
All right, let's dive right into Section 1, the crisis in the Middle East, specifically focusing on the recent escalation in the Strait of Hormuz.
Let's trace the immediate cause and effect that kind of kicked off this whole current geopolitical cycle. It started when Tehran initiated hostilities by attacking commercial ships navigating the Strait of Hormuz. In direct response to that, U.S. Central Command launched a series of targeted retaliatory strikes against Iran. And the core objective stated by military leadership here is absolutely crucial. The U.S. intends to impose unimaginably heavy costs on anyone targeting innocent, unarmed civilian crews. So this isn't just about a simple tit-for-tat response, it's about establishing a rigid deterrent. When commercial vessels are targeted, it disrupts the entire flow of global logistics. Central Command's calculation is basically that if they don't respond forcefully, it's just going to invite further attacks on civilian shipping.
Consequently, regional tensions have just skyrocketed following these maritime strikes. And it's really important to grasp the broader context here. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just any waterway. It is one of the world's most vital maritime choke points. A massive percentage of the global oil supply flows through that narrow passage every single day. So these military actions aren't merely localized skirmishes, right? They're direct reactions to severe security threats in a waterway that fundamentally underpins global trade. Any sustained conflict there threatens to completely destabilize international energy markets. A regional dispute instantly becomes an absolute priority for world leaders, pulling all their diplomatic and military focus squarely into the Middle East.
And that sudden shift in focus brings us to Section 2, internal NATO alliance tensions and the resulting diplomatic impact.
Because military operations, they rarely happen in a vacuum. This one immediately triggered a massive diplomatic ripple effect. The timeline here is actually quite revealing. Initially, the U.S. conducts its retaliatory operations against Iran, but the critical pivot happens right after, when major NATO allies flatly decline to participate or even offer logistical support for those operations. This unprecedented refusal to back a key alliance member led directly to a tense showdown. Right now, at the summit in Turkey, the U.S. president is openly expressing intense frustration over this lack of allied support. It's a pretty stark reminder that shared defense treaties on paper don't always translate to unified action in the real world when regional priorities clash.
To really gauge the temperature of this internal rift, we just have to listen to the exact words coming out of the summit. The president stated, "We don't need anybody's help. I didn't even want their help. But before I asked, they said they wouldn't be there." This, frankly, highlights a severe fracture in alliance cohesion regarding Middle Eastern strategy. From a purely strategic standpoint, public declarations of frustration from the de facto leader of NATO signal to adversaries that the Western alliance is, well, currently fractured. When allies preemptively deny assistance, it forces military planners to totally reevaluate their reliance on coalition support, which fundamentally alters how strategic deterrence is calculated moving forward.
And the depth of this diplomatic frustration has actually birthed some truly unprecedented ideas in modern geopolitics. The president floated scenarios as extreme as the United States withdrawing from the NATO alliance entirely, alongside unconventional proposals like attempting to take control of Greenland. Now, whether these are serious policy shifts or just extreme negotiating tactics, the mere fact that they are being discussed at a global summit sends absolute shockwaves through international defense architectures. If the primary guarantor of NATO security is questioning the utility of the alliance over disagreements in the Middle East, every nation relying on that security umbrella is forced to reassess their own defense postures. It perfectly illustrates how a disagreement in one region can threaten the foundational security agreements of the entire Western world.
Which naturally leads us to Section 3, the impact on the Ukraine conflict and the concurrent crisis in Eastern Europe. So while the alliance is busy fracturing over maritime strikes in the Middle East, an equally urgent crisis is accelerating over in Eastern Europe. The juxtaposition of the United States striking Iran while Russia launches devastating new rounds of attacks on Kyiv reveals a massive dual-front security pressure cooker. And guys, this is exactly where the strategic connection between the Middle East and Ukraine becomes terrifyingly clear. They aren't fighting each other, but they are competing for the exact same limited bandwidth of Western military aid, intelligence, and diplomatic focus. When adversaries in Eastern Europe see the US and its NATO allies distracted, squabbling over Middle Eastern operations, it creates a perceived window of opportunity. A fractured, distracted alliance is inherently slower to respond, which emboldens actors like Russia to escalate their offensives while the West's attention is divided.
In response to this overlapping pressure, some immediate defensive maneuvers are being drafted. Following Russia's renewed assault on Kyiv, a critical meeting is officially on the books for tomorrow between the US and Ukrainian presidents. The absolute #1 priority for this meeting is securing and rapidly deploying advanced air defense systems. But think about the logistical reality here. It is staggering. Military planners have to figure out how to fast-track highly complex missile defense systems into an active European war zone, all while simultaneously managing the fallout and operational demands of a volatile Middle East conflict. It requires threading a microscopic geopolitical needle, trying to maintain a robust deterrent against Russian aggression in Europe despite the glaring public disunity among NATO allies over Iran.
Bringing us to our final segment, Section 4, a world security analysis, looking at this interconnected strategic picture.
When we map out this entire strategic matrix, the sheer interconnectedness of modern global security is just undeniable. Look at the cascading effects of a single policy thread here. The US initiates kinetic strikes in the Middle East to protect commercial shipping. That specific action immediately alienates key NATO allies in Europe who refuse to back the play. That leads to severe diplomatic reprimands from the US at the Turkey summit. Concurrently, this fracturing of alliance unity happens at the precise moment Eastern Europe requires unified Western strength to deter Russian airstrikes on Ukraine. What this matrix really reveals is that NATO's internal policies simply do not exist in a vacuum. A disagreement over Middle Eastern strategy directly drains the diplomatic capital and unified deterrence required to project strength in Ukraine. The alliance is essentially trying to extinguish a raging fire in Europe while arguing over who holds the hose in the Middle East.
We are witnessing a truly pivotal moment where regional conflicts are testing the absolute limits of global alliances. The bandwidth of world leaders is being stretched incredibly thin across two entirely different hemispheres, proving that in today's geopolitical landscape, there is simply no such thing as an isolated incident. Every missile strike, every diplomatic slight, every refused request for aid, it all ripples across the globe, fundamentally altering the calculus of both allies and adversaries. Which brings us to the most critical question we have to ask ourselves today. Given these overlapping crises, how will the simmering tensions in the Middle East and the outright war in Eastern Europe ultimately reshape the future of NATO and our global security alliances? It's a massive, complex puzzle, and understanding it is the key to anticipating the geopolitical shifts of tomorrow. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning that bigger picture.